So as you go into sort of your fundraising journeys, the thing you have to understand is it's not all about the numbers, it's about the story. The story is as important as the numbers. All of us, I would say, pretty much all of us founders, we start with the vision of we want to be better and we want to be cheaper. Look, I think we'll continue to see over the next 2-3 years crazy growth in terms of how much capital is being invested in startups, the number of startups coming up. Stop trying to be better and cheaper at the same time. Even if you're successful, it's always a very transient opportunity. Companies are able to maintain that for a very short time period before they're forced to choose.
Welcome back to another episode of the Change Officer Podcast Middle East series. They say that change is the only constant. If this is true, we want to understand what is the change ahead. To get the answers, we talk to change makers themselves, and we invite you to join us on our quest of getting the answer. In this episode, I am humbled to be joined by Talal Bayaa, the founder and the CEO of Bayzat, one of the few startups from the early 2013 cohort of UAE's startup scene. Tune in to hear what was it like starting up back in 2013, what has changed since then, and what can we expect going forward. Talal will also share some valuable tips for other founders and business owners on the important lesson he learned the hard way. He talks about investing in sales versus product, growth strategy, and the importance of aligning your story with your growth. I truly enjoyed our conversation and how Talal managed to pass his experience and knowledge, and I hope you will find it as insightful as I did. Enjoy. Welcome to the Change Officer, Talal.
Thank you for having me.
I'm really happy that you're here and thank you for taking the time. I'm honored to have the founder of a 2013 cohort in this studio.
Yeah, one of the first batches of founders in the region.
What are the other startups from that era, 2013-14?
So the startups I can remember are Roundtable, Kareem, Property Finder, although they're earlier than
Kareem?
that.
What is that?
Souk Al-Mal was around as well. That was a long time ago. That's as much as I can remember. Seems like a lifetime ago.
Yeah. So I want to use this opportunity to talk about what happened in the meantime and the fact that this is the Change Officer podcast and we are exploring the concept of the change. A lot of things changed since 2013 and starting up, and now some didn't, like banks, but a lot of other things change. When you compare 2013 and now 2021, how does it look to you?
The pace of change has been pretty phenomenal. Back in 2013, from startup licenses and that type of concept didn't really exist. No angel networks, accelerators, seed funds, even VCs, right? So our first VC investor was Beko Capital, and the company was even formed back then. We were talking to one of the founders before he had even started with Beko Capital. Fast forward to today, you have so many resources, both, in terms of government support, raising capital, even at a talent level, right? So today people are willing to join a startup that has no traction, that's just in sort of an idea stage. Back then there was very few willing to take that risk.
And at the time when you were starting, I love this whole story, how you bootstrapped the business and had to work in parallel while you were investing in your business.
Yeah, so my co-founder and I, we kept our full-time jobs, and we actually set up a company. We hired 4 engineers. We had sort of the first customer as well, all while we had our full-time jobs. So, just working on the weekends, working the evenings, and we had to get some traction. And because there was no access to funding, we also wanted to make sure that once I moved full-time to the company, the ball was already rolling.
All right.
We couldn't afford for me to join and then be like, okay, let's start hiring people. We had to have the machine already operating so that when I come, we're not wasting any money.
Absolutely. having money and not having money while building a business doesn't necessarily two opposite ways completely of starting up. But not having money is not necessarily a bad thing.
I would say less absolute terms, but not having too little money and not having too much money. You need the right balance, right? If you have too much money, the amount of inefficiencies that build up in the business are just enormous. Easy to become unfocused. Stop trying to prioritize how you spend money. You just try to do everything at once because it's easy. I have the money. I can hire someone to do this. I can hire someone to do that. Very dangerous place to be. And it's not in the best interest of your shareholders. Too little money. I think, survival is amazing at bringing out innovation. We all probably saw this in COVID as entrepreneurs. But at the same time, you need money to scale, right? It's a very competitive world. I don't think there's any industry that's not being disrupted, and that means you need money to be able to scale.
I guess it's about timing, right? The time when you inject some more capital in your business to actually scale.
Yeah, definitely. It's about timing, and it's about hopefully getting the right investors early on. But look, the reality is most of us, we don't have the luxury of choosing our investors. We need to take whatever money is available to us. That's the reality. So a lot of people talk about, choose your investors wisely. Yeah, that's an amazing place to be if you can get there. But it's dangerous advice to most of us, other founders, because we don't get to choose, right? And that's something that's always important to keep in mind and not get carried away with.
No, absolutely. And I guess that changes as you go from stage to stage. The earlier you are, the less opportunity to pick your investors have. Did this change from 2013 to 2021 slightly?
It's changed just because there's so much more capital now. There's a lot of competition between VCs, growth equity funds, hedge funds are starting to invest, and you have some government initiatives, and there's a lot of capital out there. So definitely today you have more of an opportunity to choose investors versus 10 years ago it was, please, anyone who can give me anyone who's willing to invest in VC, I'll take the money.
Absolutely. Yeah. How did startups evolve since then? Now when you look at the cohorts from 2019-20.
So I have to say I'm not really involved that much in the startup scene. Of course, I know a lot of the younger companies doing amazing things. I would say they're able to scale faster today and sort of reach revenue milestones that maybe took us a couple of years to reach because there's more capital, but also because there's more experience in the talent, right? In the market. You can hire people who worked at, Bayzat, Kareem, Property Finder, who've actually seen that journey and know how to accelerate it. It's not as scary to spend $1 million on marketing when you've raised a couple $1 million because that person who's spending it's done it before. That wasn't the case in 2013.
That's a big one. When you get $1 million for the first time, it's scary, right?
It's scary, and the richest we ever felt was when we were completely bootstrapped. In the early days, my co-founder was paying my salary outside of the company, and we had 3 engineers, and we had $350,000 in the bank. That seemed like it could last forever. And then all of a sudden, today you raise $10 million and you're not comfortable. You're not sleeping well because you know that you're going to spend it pretty quickly.
How long is the runway with 10 millions?
With 10 million, so, look, it varies by companies, obviously. If you're in B2C consumer, it's not very long in terms of runway.
Most of the capital goes towards marketing?
Towards marketing, and it's easy to keep, accelerating your spend. When you're talking about the B2B or SaaS, the rounds aren't as big as for B2C companies. So 10 million you could do some pretty amazing things with.
Well,
look, it's about recurring revenue at the end of the day, right? So I think in B2C, a lot of the time you're spending the money to generate revenue, period, right? Whereas with SaaS, we're spending the money to generate new customer revenue, right? But we already know we've locked in most of our customers at very high retention rates. And what that means is you're spending more efficiently and you're able to get to, a bigger milestone versus if you're in consumer, because the way investors look at the company and value the business are very different, because they understand that, okay, maybe SaaS doesn't grow 1,000% a year, but it's highly recurring revenue.
Yeah. I want to use the opportunity while I have you here in the studio. And you are one of the couple of founders out there who's been around, right? And that experience is really important. So let's position you for the next 10-15 minutes in a advisor seat to other startups who are out there, right? Who are listening. Many of you perhaps you already know or you spoke to, but I think lessons that you've learned over the previous, 8 years, are very valuable for everyone out there, especially going from round to round, right? From angel to seed to series A, series B that are followed with the growth of the company. What are some of the failures or the failure or the mistake that you made at your early days that most likely a lot of founders out there are currently headed for?
So as you go into sort of your fundraising journeys, the thing you have to understand is it's not all about the numbers, it's about the story, right? The story is as important as the numbers. And that means you as the founder are the one who's in control of the story. And you're kind of having to build a story that can sustain you from round to round in the coming years. And you shouldn't fall to external pressure to kind of build the story how someone thinks it should be built, because you're the one who has in your mind the long-term vision. And as you start thinking about the story, obviously you have to kind of relate that to the numbers as well. And what kind of metrics you choose are very important, right? If you choose, after a seed round to start talking about revenue metrics, it's a pretty dangerous place to be, because the reality is maybe your product today is good enough to get you to the next round at a nice valuation in terms of revenue growth. But more likely than not, you're going to have to make some pretty big changes, pretty big pivots. And that means changing your product to achieve product market fit. And if you're still kind of pushing the story of revenue growth that early on, you are caught between a rock and a hard place, right? You have to invest in sales marketing to actually keep scaling, but you know that you're not spending it efficiently because the product's not where you need it to be yet. So I would say most companies or founders should really position the early story around something to do with product market fit and those types of metrics.
So what happened in your case?
So we had a very big pivot from sort of B2C fintech to SaaS, HR SaaS, and employee benefits. So obviously there's a huge amount of changes we had to make on the product side. And at the same time, we were very happy with the early revenue traction we were showing, getting to a couple $100,000 of revenue back then, had raised a very small amount of money only. And the reality was the shift was going to take a lot more time in terms of getting the product ready. But we also wanted to keep pushing revenue growth. So we kept spending on sales marketing, and obviously that starts becoming more and more inefficient spend. And the reality is we probably should have said, we're just going to shut down everything to sales marketing, get the product ready. That's where it's best to deploy all our resources, and then we'll come back and start growing. But, it's circumstance. Obviously we had raised money by then. It's not something we could have pitched to shareholders.
So for the founders and the businesses out there who are looking at doing what you're suggesting, what's the step 1, step 2, step 3 things that they should pay attention to as they're switching from one phase to another?
So the first step is understand what your strategy is going to be. In business, there's only 2 types of strategy. you're either the low cost player or you're the differentiated premium player, right? So it's Apple versus HTC, right? That's really what that's how business operates around the world. And I didn't come up with this. It's just, once you start reading a lot of business books and strategy books.
So you either go for the low cost product and mass outreach, right? Or you go for the premium service and a very specific niche group of customers.
Exactly. All of us, I would say, pretty much all of us founders, we start with the vision of we want to be better and we want to be cheaper. I haven't seen anyone come up with a vision other than that. But if you look at all the Fortune 500 companies, they very clearly have chosen one approach versus the other. Which is the right approach for you, I can't really tell you. But, the reality is there can only be one lowest cost player. Right? There can only be one by definition. So that's very challenging approach to choose. And then if you look at, the most successful companies who've been, in the S&P 500 for the longest period of time, etc., usually they fall in the differentiated player space. So I would say stop trying to be better and cheaper at the same time. Even if you're successful, it's always a very transient opportunity. Companies are able to maintain that for a very short time period before they're forced to choose. Then from there, understand who your customer is. And then the third step is just spend as much time with them to build the best product for their needs, for their problems.
To unpack the third one, because it's very commonly mentioned as an important step, talk to your customers, explore your customers, etc. From theory to actual execution, how do you do that in your case? How do you spend time with customers? Do you sit with them around the table or do you?
So if I talk about, back in 2013, 14, if you were reaching out to customers, it was pretty challenging to do, right? The concept of, hey, there's someone who's going to come interview you as a customer was very strange.
For a cup of coffee or like
today, every other week I'm getting, an Amazon gift card offer to sit down with a company that I'm a customer of to give them feedback. So today, to achieve that is one, you have to really invest in building an amazing product and engineering team. Usually we think of them as one team. Again, back in 2013, the role of product manager wasn't really something that was out there. You had project managers. And then two is, you remove as many barriers as possible to talking to customers for your team, right? So no red tape, nothing like that. You want to be able to tell your team, you can go on our CRM, see any customer, just go through these main checks before you reach out to them and reach out to them. And you want to have a budget to offer them something as a gift, just, here's how you request it and then go for it. So you want to eliminate as much red tape. A lot of companies are very protective around, talking to customers. Sales doesn't necessarily want product to reach out to them, etc. But the moment you remove all that red tape, then every week, each of your product managers are speaking to, a dozen customers, just like your designers, your product specialists. So, and then the last one is getting other people in the organization to actually start thinking in the mindset of, okay, I'm not only here to serve the customer, I want to learn about their problems, right? Give them solutions and then actually feed that back into the organization, to the company to help us keep improving our product, right? So it's not just a product team's job to do that.
Yeah, interesting. So for anyone following those steps that you mentioned now, what are some of the early signs or red flags that they can see along the way to notice that they're doing something wrong? And we're talking about the overall now, as you're growing as a company and how you evolve your strategy. You made a mistake where you invested heavily in sales and marketing, but then the product market fit couldn't really cater the need of the market that you positioned your business in. And then you figured that actually you need to work more on the product and slow down a bit with sales. So what are the early signs for other founders and business owners that they're getting something wrong here?
I think qualitative signs are if customers are not genuinely getting excited about what you're showing them. If in meetings they're not saying highly positive things, because
like wow,
wow,
this is
exactly,
changing my life.
This is exactly. Not to say every customer is going to say that. I'm not saying 50% of your customers need to say that. Otherwise, people would expect 50% sales conversion rates. But if you're not hearing those things, then there's probably a lot more work to do. And then the second one, which is more difficult actually, is just the data part, right? Because especially in that early stage, you haven't really optimized most of your funnel, right? So a lot of times it may not be something that's necessarily wrong with the product. It could be on the customer onboarding cycle, the sales side, the marketing side. So that one's actually more challenging in my experience early on to gauge and say, okay, there's some issues here. But I would say the data part to focus the most on is once a customer starts using the product, what's their behavior look like and how much are they using it? How often are they using it? There, the numbers won't lie.
In case, so I'm out there with my business, I'm doing an amazing job with my marketing. The demand is huge. They're waiting for my product, but my product is, as you described in your case, cannot really cater everything that is it the promise, the kind of the wrong promise that you made. What is something that we can notice along the way so we stop investing in marketing and sales on time so we don't end up in this situation?
So it could be the promise, or it could be that the problem you're solving for the customer is not that important or not something they're willing to pay a lot of money for. And in terms of, figuring out when you need to start reallocating capital, a lot of it's to do with your sales team, right? So if you feel like you've given them pretty reasonable sales quotas, but 80% of your teams keeps missing their quota, then you have more work to do. Obviously, part of it could be on the training side and the talent side, but in general, there's a lot more work to do on the product side as well to support them.
All right, let's talk a bit more about what's ahead of us. So we discussed what was it in 2013, what was it, how is it now? What do you anticipate and how do you anticipate things will evolve and change in the region for the next 3 to 5 years when it comes to, scaling business, starting business and the overall startup? You're not even a startup anymore, right? You're now a business. But what do you think are the changes that we will see in the next 3 to 5 years?
From the perspective of the startup ecosystem, look, I think we'll continue to see over the next 2-3 years crazy growth in terms of how much capital is being invested in startups, the number of startups coming up. Most of the VCs are raising even bigger funds now. We have to keep in mind that just like everything, it's cyclical, right? Up and down. So right now we're in sort of a bull market for VC, which is great. Most VCs are making money now because it's a bull market and they'll be able to raise bigger funds. I'm not here to, time the cycle of, when it will go down, but assuming things keep, growing as they are today, I think we'll continue to see a lot more companies going into sort of the growth equity phase, which is still actually very small today, right? So post Series B, how many are actually raising bigger rounds? Hopefully how many are starting to prove to investors they can, become sort of EBITDA positive, and actually be businesses that generate massive cash flows. So I think that's going to be the story for the next three years when you're talking about, post Series B companies. And we'll get there. And I think we'll start seeing some listings as well, probably first in the Saudi market on the Tadawul, but then eventually also on the UAE exchanges.
If there was one thing that you could change as the change officer, so say that you got this role of the change officer of the Middle East, what would that one thing be?
In terms of the ecosystem, or
well, let's say that you have completely or complete freedom to change anything that you want. What would you work on and what would you change?
I would hope that, we'd have something similar to the EU across Middle East and North Africa. So kind of breaking down a lot of the barriers for companies to be able to operate in different markets and, have common regulatory frameworks. I think that's the most positive change that could happen, because all of a sudden now, instead of looking at, UAE being a population of 11 million, Saudi of 34, Kuwait, Egypt, etc. Now it's actually sort of a big market, right? And that's really how startups in the EU speak, right? It's very believable for them to say my addressable market is all of Western Europe, right? No one's going to question that because they see that it's very easy to go in between these countries.
No, absolutely, and you're sharing the opinion as many other business owners over there. It is a big opportunity. Do you see any traction happening in that space?
Way above my pay grade. I know there are efforts being made with specific regulators, right? So maybe on the financial services side, there are specific efforts being made there. Obviously, for us, that'd be a great start because we are, a fintech as well. I know for a fact those discussions are happening, but obviously they'll take some time.
All right. Do you see that happening in the next 3, 5, 7, 10 years?
I would also, err on the side of caution, say 10 years. So don't, get ready to go into those markets one by one. Don't plan on something like this happening.
All right. To wrap up, we're going to play a quick game. So I'm going to give you 2 options. You just pick one. Ready?
Cool.
All right. Ants or elephants?
Elephants.
$10 million or bonus 2 years of life?
$10 million.
That's what I'm talking about. $100,000 in marketing or $100,000 in relationship with clients?
$100,000 in relationship with clients.
Making a bridge or jumping across?
Jumping across.
Turning back time or seeing the future?
Turning back time.
Long and steady or fast and furious?
Fast and furious.
10. 1 year on a deserted island or 1 year in deep jungles of Amazonia?
Deserted island.
Being invisible or being able to fly?
Fly.
The Change Officer podcast or the Joe Rogan Experience?
Change Officer podcast.
Talal, thanks for coming, man.
Thank you very much for having me.
Thank you for taking the time, and I hope that we managed to share some valuable insights and information with other people out there, and just get them more exposed to what the future holds and how to get ready for it. I hope to talk to you again in soon, maybe next year, just to see how things are progressing, and until then we'll stay in touch.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot.